Americans for Fair Taxation presents the Weekly Chairman's Report, written by Steve Hayes, president of Americans for Fair Taxation, and recorded by Bob Paxton, a volunteer with the Florida FAIRtax Educational Association. And now, this week's Chairman's Report.
Hello, I'm Bob Paxton with the AFFT Chairman's Report for Friday, June 28, 2024. This week's Chairman's Report is written by Randy Fischer, an AFFT Vice President and Board member. Annihilation. Could the unthinkable ever happen to our great country? Victor Davis Hanson addresses this very subject in his latest book, The End of Everything. In a recent article in the June 2024 edition of AMAC magazine entitled, Can Societal Annihilation Happen Again?, Victor discusses many aspects of what has historically led certain civilizations to experience a complete elimination of their culture, their way of life, language, physical space, people, and long customs and traditions. Examples of former thriving civilizations that Mr. Hanson discusses include the Aztecs, Byzantines, Carthaginians, and others. Interestingly, a common thread that appears throughout these historical episodes is that these civilizations were not fully aware that they were in decline and that their enemies wished to be rid of them. So, what has this got to do with the fair tax? Well, everything's always relative to its counterpart, and in this case, the income payroll tax system. Mr. Hanson discusses how a people's resentments against the majesties of these eternal cities and some of their imperial practices also contributed to the perfect storm of destruction that these civilizations ultimately succumbed to. Our problems in the U.S. seem to be stacked extremely high against us. We're short on munitions, we're $36 trillion in debt, our national borders are porous, the rule of law and application of justice appears to no longer be impartial or blind, and the country is divided on these and numerous other issues. However, let's not forget how our income tax is another ruling class club that is used to bludgeon the American people into submission. Our bureaucrats harass us and use medieval techniques to collect revenue, such as the civil asset forfeiture. They also employ a division of government with nearly 100,000 people to administer their monstrosity. The income tax is a tool that divides and separates our people instead of uniting them. The income tax punishes increased productivity and success and rewards failures and flops. The income tax drives a stake into the heart of our most sacred possession that we toil, sweat, and labor for, our income, which for most of us is the only way we can live the American dream. The incentive is certainly there to pay less in taxes to the federal government. Our income payroll tax system is supposed to be voluntary. We voluntarily prepare the endless forms and file federal income tax returns each year that are supposed to comply with the Internal Revenue Code. But no one in Washington understands the tens of thousands of pages and regulations that make up the Internal Revenue Code. However, each of us taxpayers are held responsible for understanding the incomprehensible Internal Revenue Code, and any failure on our part to file as they think we should is punished with penalties of cash and threats of even being sent to prison. The income tax is a method of tax collection that psychologically disposes many people to illegal evasion because they can rationalize and justify evasion for a multitude of reasons. While our income tax system is falling apart at the seams with over $1 trillion in annual illegal evasion, we must not forget that the people generally despise our income payroll tax system as well. This means that, at least on one front, we have the power in our hands to adopt a common sense piece of legislation, H.R. 25, and replace our antiquated income payroll tax system with the fair tax. By doing so, we can avoid what Mr. Hanson calls the resentments against the majesties, at least as it relates to the country's system of taxation and collection. We have enough enemies, enough issues, enough self-inflicted wounds and other faults. We don't need to continue with the madness of our income tax system, and the fair tax is the answer. Our government undoubtedly conjures up feelings and resentments against the majesties, so let's just take one of these hazards out of play, push back against a dam with 1,000,000 cracks in it, and preserve our great country a little bit longer with the fair tax. In conclusion, Randy clearly shows the benefits of the fair tax and why it's a winning strategy with the public. The choice is easy. Do we want a system for funding the federal government that is so simple that everyone can understand it, that shows the cost of the federal government on every retail receipt so all of us understand what we're paying, that helps U.S. companies compete with foreign competitors, that keeps jobs in the U.S. rather than exporting them to other countries, that permanently establishes the solvency of Social Security and Medicare, and is the largest transfer of power from D.C. to the people since the Constitution was adopted? D.C. is ignoring the one real solution that allows us to remain citizens and not subjects, the FAIRtax. The FAIRtax is simple, non-invasive, but most of all, it works. The solution? Pass the FAIRtax. Now, just why would D.C. pass the FAIRtax and give up an almost unlimited source of donations? Well, they won't, at least not voluntarily. The only way they will is if the rest of us demand it. Isn't it time to end this ludicrous tax collection system and the IRS along with it? Now, there's going to be a vote on the FAIRtax in the House of Representatives. We now have the opportunity to force all members of the House to show where they stand. They can vote for the present income payroll tax system, or they can vote for the FAIRtax. They can support the corrupt income tax in the IRS, or they can vote to eliminate it. It can't be any simpler than that. They can hide the true cost of their government, or they can pass the FAIRtax and show everyone the true cost of government on every retail receipt. And finally, they can support the largest transfer of power from the government to the people, the FAIRtax, or they can vote against it. Now, if members think the FAIRtax needs to be amended to address a problem, then they can propose the change. Don't let them get away with rejecting the entire bill because it has a perceived flaw in it that can be easily addressed, and don't think for an instant that there aren't any flaws in the income tax. Help us bring about real tax reform and stop future IRS abuses. By contributing or investing $10.40 a month, you help provide a financial base to Americans for fair taxation. Now, if you can make larger contributions/investments, these will be used not for salaries, as we're all volunteers, but for the needed updates to our economic studies, which will be vital for all future years. Please go to fairtax.org to invest in AFFT and help us pass the FAIRtax. It's an investment in your and your family's future.
This has been the Weekly Chairman's Report, written by Steve Hayes, President of Americans for Fair Taxation. Check back every week for news and information about the FAIRtax, and learn why the FAIRtax should replace our antiquated federal income tax system. If you'd like to receive a copy of the Chairman's Report in your inbox every week, sign up at fairtax.org.